What's the most shocking thing you discovered about your in-laws? My sister-in-law held a funeral for her unborn daughter and made sure everyone knew the miscarriage was my fault. Jessica told everyone I pushed her down the stairs when she was 7 months pregnant during an argument about money, and the fall killed her baby instantly. My brother Lucas wouldn't speak to me because his wife would sob and trace the footprint tattoo on her wrist whenever someone said my name. She carried ultrasound photos everywhere and bought a pink marble headstone for Isabella that she visited with fresh flowers every week, while my parents banned me from family dinners and stopped taking my calls. For 6 months, I lived as the family pariah while she wore maternity clothes to gatherings because regular clothes reminded her that her body was empty now, and my mother would hold her while she shook with grief that looked completely real. But here's what really happened during that argument. She stormed out without a scratch, and I never touched her at all. My cousin, who didn't know about the incident at the time, mistakenly sat us at the same table at her wedding. And while Jessica showed that ultrasound around, I noticed she'd used whiteout to cover up a name in the corner. That tiny detail consumed me for weeks until I did something desperate and went into debt to hire a private investigator, who started digging while I fixated on how she'd walked away from our argument without a scratch, yet somehow lost a baby over it. 3 weeks later, he called with something that made me pull over on the highway. The medical records he'd found showed Jessica had gotten her tubes tied at 23 years old, which was 2 years before she even met Lucas at that Denver conference. The doctor's notes said she'd insisted she never wanted children to ruin her body despite counseling about her age and making such a permanent decision. The investigator kept digging and found receipts from a medical supply company where she'd bought 3 different sizes of pregnancy bellies, and they'd arrived 1 week before she announced her pregnancy at Easter dinner. The Facebook Marketplace listing where she'd bought the ultrasound for $20 came with seller messages joking about fooling family and friends, but warning that some people use them for darker purposes than pranks. Everything suddenly made sense because she'd announced the pregnancy right after Lucas said maybe they should break up since they'd been trying for 2 years without success, and he wanted children more than anything. The investigator found old receipts showing she'd been buying ovulation tests for 2 years to show Lucas even though pregnancy was impossible with her tubes tied. The journal entries from her car were the worst part because she'd written out her entire plan, including the exact date to fake the miscarriage for maximum sympathy, and she'd been practicing crying using menthol drops she kept in her purse. She'd been secretly recording real mothers at her grief support group telling their stories so she could steal their exact words and repeat them as her own. The planning was so detailed that she'd researched which week of pregnancy would create the most sympathy and had screenshot other women's memorial posts to copy their wording. She'd studied baby development websites to learn exactly where to clutch her stomach when describing Isabella's kicks so her performance would look authentic. The investigator found she'd even purchased a recording of a real baby's heartbeat to play during fake doctor visits that she always claimed were too emotional for Lucas to attend. By the time I finished reading everything, I felt physically sick, knowing my family had been mourning at a grave for a baby that could never have existed. My mother's 60th birthday dinner became ground zero when I walked in carrying copies of everything for each person who'd called me a murderer. Jessica started her hyperventilating performance, but I handed the medical records directly to Lucas and watched his face change as he read tubes tied successfully, with a date before they'd ever met. She tried grabbing the papers, but I was already handing out copies while she screamed about fabricated documents until my mother looked at the dates and whispered that the surgery happened before Jessica even knew Lucas existed. The ultrasound listing was undeniable when I showed them the exact image she'd been carrying being sold online with someone else's name still visible under the whiteout. She broke completely and admitted she'd had to trap him with shared grief because he was going to leave her. And then she said, "At least I gave you the experience of thinking you were going to be a father." Lucas walked out without another word, tears streaming down his face, while my father blocked her from following him and told her to leave before he called the police. Jessica fled to Arizona and we never saw her again, and Lucas spent months in therapy learning to grieve a daughter who was never real.